The wind had a way of speaking out here, long, low, and hollow, carrying the smell of dust and sage across miles of nothing. Luke Mallory had learned to listen to it, if only because it was the only voice that kept him company. His days were measured in the slow swing of the sun and the creak of the porch boards under his boots. Morning brought the pale light over the San Pedro Valley, and with it, the same ritual. Coffee boiled black, a check on the horses, a survey of the fence line, and then, nothing but work. Work until the body ached enough to make sleep come easier than thought. It had been years since Luke had heard laughter in these hills. Years since he'd let anyone close enough to share a meal at his table. The war had burned that out of him, left scars no doctor could dress. He'd buried more than friends in the red earth. He'd buried the man he was before the gunpowder, before the smoke. On this morning, the sun rose blood orange over the ridges, and Luke saddled up to ride into town. He needed salt, flour, and a part for the pump that kept the well from drying up. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the hardpan, the sound bouncing off canyon walls. Bisbee was a rough-edged mining town, half tents and half timber buildings, all of it coated in the same powdery dust. It smelled of sweat, whiskey, and hot metal. Luke didn't linger in town more than he had to. He bought what he needed, nodded to the shopkeep, and kept to himself. But as he led his gelding down the main street toward the blacksmith, the air changed, not the wind. This was human, heavier. A knot of people had gathered near the old well, their voices sharp, tinged with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. Luke would have walked past, except the sound of the auctioneer's voice cut through the air. And then he saw her. She stood on a platform made from 2 wagon beds pushed together, hands bound in front, ankles roped. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, dust streaked across her cheek, but her back was straight, her chin lifted. Black hair hung in loose braids over her shoulders, and her eyes, dark, steady, didn't move to meet the stares that clung to her. The man beside her was talking fast, his voice oily, describing her in a way that made Luke's gut knot. Apache, he said. Last of her band after the soldiers swept the canyon. Strong enough to work a ranch, young enough for other uses. The crowd laughed, and Luke felt his hands tighten on the reins. He told himself it wasn't his business. He'd spent years keeping his head down, staying clear of other people's trouble. But the longer he stood there, the more that voice in his head, the one he thought the wind had worn away, started to speak again. The bidding started low, men tossing out numbers like they were haggling over a mule. The girl, no, woman, didn't flinch. Luke noticed the raw skin at her wrists, the way she shifted her weight like she was ready to bolt if the rope gave her even an inch. Some fool near the front made a joke loud enough for the others to hear. More laughter. Luke's jaw worked. Before he'd decided to, he was stepping forward. The sun was hot on his back, the crowd parting just enough to let him through. He stopped at the edge of the platform, eyes on the auctioneer. How much? His voice was low, but it carried. The man grinned, sensing coin. Current bid's 30. You want in, stranger? Luke reached into his coat, pulled out a leather pouch. 50. Cash. The crowd murmured. The auctioneer's smile widened, but Luke didn't give him the chance to play it up. Now, he said. A few minutes later, it was done. The rope was handed to him, but he didn't take it. Instead, he pulled a knife from his belt, cut it clean, and let it fall to the dust. The woman's eyes flicked to his. Just once. Unreadable. You're free to walk, Luke said quietly, so only she could hear. But if you've got nowhere else, I'm headed west. She didn't answer, just stepped down from the platform, slow and measured, and stood beside his horse. The crowd dispersed, disappointed there'd be no more spectacle. Luke adjusted the pack on the gelding, handed her the canteen without a word. She drank, handed it back, and they started toward the edge of town. By the time the last building was behind them, the wind had found its voice again. Luke didn't ask her name, didn't offer his. Out here, the desert didn't care who you'd been before. All it cared was whether you could endure the dust and silence long enough to see another sunrise. But as they rode into the long stretch of empty land between Bisbee and the Mallory Ranch, Luke found himself glancing at her more than once, and every time, he caught the same steady gaze, the same unbroken line of her shoulders. Whatever storm had brought her here, she'd stood through it. And maybe, just maybe, so could he. They hadn't made it 10 steps from the platform when a voice snapped behind them like a whip. "Hold there." The auctioneer's hat brim threw a thin blade of shade across his eyes as he hurried over. Ledger tucked under one arm, pen jutting like a thorn. A few men drifted closer, the scent of whiskey, grease, and sunburned skin folding into the heat. Luke didn't turn at first. He tightened the cinch strap on his gelding, checked the pack straps by feel, salt, flour, the iron coupling for the pump, then faced the man. "You've got my coin," Luke said. "We're done." "Paper," the auctioneer replied, smoothing the ledger open with the back of his hand. "Bill of sale. Owners like to keep things tidy." "I'm not an owner." Luke's voice stayed even, the way a still pond keeps the sky in one piece. "You sold a rope. I cut it." A chuckle rolled through the small crowd. A big-shouldered fellow in a sun-bleached hat stuck a toothpick between his lips and chewed it like it had offended him. "Man pays 50 to make himself a saint." He leaned toward the woman. Too close. Eyes narrowed. "What's your price when the nights turn cold? Apache?" Luke didn't look at the man. He set the knife he'd used to cut the rope back into its sheath. The blade had been sharp enough to shave a hair. His hand stilled on the hilt. The woman kept her chin high, wrists reddened where the rope had gnawed. The dust had dried to a pale crust along the edge of her cheekbones. If his approach had troubled her, it didn't show. Her gaze moved once, past the men, to the horizon glimmering white above the town roofs, then back to the ground at her feet. "Name for the books," the auctioneer pressed, flicking a spot of dried ink from his finger. "Her name?" "Right free," Luke said. That got a sharper laugh. The big-shouldered fellow stepped in, reaching. Luke's hand left the knife, rose, and found the man's wrist mid-air. It was nothing. A turn, a step, a small hinge of motion born of long practice, and the man bent, breath hissing through his teeth. The toothpick fell into the dust. When Luke let go, the man took a half-step back and decided the sun had better places to be. Something old and heavy moved behind Luke's ribs, the place where anger lived, where all the years of keeping to himself kept it fed. He let the air go, slow. He looked to the woman. "You can say your name," he told her quietly. "Or not." For a breath, only the hot wind answered, tugging at the loose end of the cut rope on the ground. Then she touched the inside of her wrist where the skin was raw, and spoke a single word that carried more weight than the auctioneer's ledger and all its lines. "Ayanna," she said. It came round, clean. One name. No more. The auctioneer scribbled. "Fine, fine," he muttered, as if tasting the syllables would settle them into his book. "Ayanna, sold." Luke slid 2 folded banknotes from his pocket, laid them flat across the open page, then covered them with 3 gold coins. Paper made men talk. Metal ended conversations. The auctioneer's eyes softened at the clink. Luke tapped the ledger once. "Not sold." put released. The pen hesitated. The line of the nib wavered, then dragged across the page. It looked like any other word when it dried. They moved again. Ayanna matched his step without looking to him for pace. By the well. A boy stared until his mother's hand found his shoulder and turned him. A pair of mules, tied outside the smithy, flicked their ears at a cloud of flies. Iron rang from inside, steady as a metronome. From the open doors of the saloon came the soft roll of a piano, missing 2 keys, and a laugh that had learned to pretend. Luke slowed near a peddler's cart, where bolts of cloth lay like captured light. He said nothing, only reached and lifted a plain shawl the color of unbleached wool. It wasn't fine. It was strong. He paid, folded it once, and set it across the saddle horn nearest Ayanna's hand. She didn't touch it yet. The sun's weight pressed harder now, the town's edges shimmering. She kept pace. At the livery. Luke asked for a second mount. He could have put her up behind him. The road was long, and the land knew how to take skin from bone. But there were different kinds of hurt, and some weren't the land's to give. The liveryman squinted, measuring Luke as men in towns do when they see a stranger spend money without blinking. "That roan's sure-footed," the man said, nodding at a mare whose coat held the shade of dried creek mud. "Not fast, but she'll keep you honest." Luke checked the mare's hooves, ran a palm along her withers, watched her eyes. He paid. The liveryman went to fetch a bridle, but Ayanna had already stepped closer. Palm turned to the mare's breath until horse and woman shared the same slow rhythm. The mare's ears tipped forward, then eased back. A quiet agreement. They saddled without words. When the bridle came, Ayanna lifted it. The set of her hands was sure. She had done this before. The bit slid home. The mare chewed once, settled, outside the livery. The street lay white and bright, as if the sun had filed it down to bone. Luke passed the canteen again. Ayanna drank and returned it with the same deliberate care she'd used earlier. A strand of hair had slipped free of her braid and stuck, damp, against her temple. The shawl waited where he'd left it. She took it up then. Not as thanks, not as capitulation, just an answer to what the light demanded of skin. They walked the horses to the town's edge together. The church bell, old, with a crack that gave it a tired sound, marked the hour. Shadows shortened. The smell of hot pitch from the new rooftops got left behind with the piano and the iron and the ledger ink. "Luke," he said finally, "because a name offered once makes a different road than one kept back." Ayanna glanced at him, the smallest flick of attention that meant she had heard and filed it where it belonged. "Luke," she echoed, trying it once as if balance testing a tool. The name didn't change shape in her mouth. He felt that the way a man feels a breeze shift before he sees the grass move. The desert took them gradually. Town thinned to a scatter of hitching rails and barrels and the last lean-to. Then nothing but the road, shouldering into open space. The ground held the heat like a secret it meant to keep. Mesquite leaned in 2s and 3s, thorned and patient. Far off, a hawk rode an invisible current, every feather set just so. A mile out. Luke slid down from the saddle and loosened his horse's cinch a notch. He didn't say why. Ayanna dismounted too and matched the adjustment on the roan. They were small things, the kind people in towns don't notice. Out here, small kept you alive. They mounted again. Dust lifted at each hoof fall, drifted back as if to say it always had the last word. Luke's eye caught the thin, rubbed mark where rope had sat at Ayanna's ankle. He looked away. He had learned, in other places, that staring at a wound could be another kind of knife. They spoke once more, before the land quieted them for good. "You chose to walk," he said, after a stretch of road where the only sound was leather and breath. "You can still choose." Her hands rested light on the reins. She studied the 2 lines of their shadows stitched to the road ahead, and only then answered. "I will see the place where the water comes from," she said. Luke nodded. The well at his ranch wasn't much. A stone ring, a stubborn pump, cool depth. He pictured the way dawn made the water skin flash like metal when the bucket rose. The way morning's first swallow could set a man right better than whiskey ever had. He pictured it, and found his grip ease. Behind them, the town's noise thinned to a rumor. Ahead, the land opened without promise or threat, just itself. Luke let his horse find the right pace and did not look back. Ayanna's roan moved as if it had always known this road. The shawl's edge lifted when the wind came, settled when it passed. Now and again the roan's ear flicked toward Ayanna at some small sound he couldn't hear, and once, only once, when a vulture's shadow skated over them. Ayanna's hand slid forward to the mare's neck and stayed there until the shadow broke against a rise and was gone. By the time the ridges began to show their bones in afternoon light, Luke's shirt was dark at the middle of his back, where sweat had gathered and dried twice. He felt the anger from the platform cooling in him, the way iron cools when the smith stops working it. The words from the men had drifted away with the heat. The pen's line in the ledger would dry too. The wind kept what mattered and carried the rest off. He looked once more at Ayanna, her posture, the way the dust lay along her jaw, the hawk quiet of her eyes, and then gave the land his attention again. Behind his ribs, something that had been braced for years took one slow breath and didn't brace again. They rode on, the sound of hooves fitting itself to the days-long, patient measure. And when the wind spoke, it sounded less like an empty thing and more like a road with room enough for 2. By the time the sun had dropped low enough to stain the hills with copper light, Luke's ranch came into view. It wasn't much. A square of weathered boards, the roofline tilting just enough to betray the years. A corral slouched against one side, and beyond that, a lean-to shelter for the horses. The well stood near the porch, its stone ring worn smooth from years of rope and calloused hands. Luke dismounted first, letting his gelding walk itself to the trough. Ayanna followed without needing to be told, swinging down from the roan with a quiet grace. Her eyes moved slow, taking in the shape of the land, the rise of the hills to the west, the cluster of cottonwoods down by the creek bed, the faint shimmer of heat still hanging above the earth. He led both horses to water, then began the familiar motions, loosening cinches, sliding off saddles, rubbing the sweat marks from their coats. Ayanna joined in, wordless, her movements steady, as though she'd done the same work in another life. When they were finished, the horses stood head down, tails flicking against the last of the flies. Luke gestured toward the porch. "Inside," he said, not unkindly. The door opened on a single room that held more silence than furniture. The stove sat cold in one corner, a narrow bed against the far wall, a table with 2 mismatched chairs in between. Dust lay in the corners, but the boards were swept clean. Ayanna stepped inside, the shadow of the doorway cutting across her shoulders. She didn't ask where she'd sleep. Luke crossed to a cedar chest near the bed, pulled out a wool blanket, and set it on the table. "Floor's yours," he said. Her eyes flicked once to the bed, then to the blanket, but she gave no sign of protest. Instead, she knelt, unrolled the wool with a smooth snap, and began arranging it in the space between the stove and the wall, close enough to feel heat when a fire burned, far enough to be her own corner. Luke busied himself at the stove, laying kindling, coaxing flame from a single match. The smell of dry wood catching filled the room, soft and familiar. From a shelf above, he took down a tin of beans, a small sack of cornmeal, and the strip of salt pork he'd bought that morning. He worked without speaking, the way he always had, letting the rhythm of simple tasks fill the spaces where words might go. Ayanna moved to the wash basin, poured a small measure of water from the bucket, and began scrubbing her hands and face. She didn't splash. Each movement was deliberate, careful not to waste a drop. When she finished, she glanced toward the door. Luke nodded once, and she slipped outside, through the window. He watched her walk the length of the yard, pause at the well, and stand there with her hand resting lightly on the pump handle. She didn't try to draw water, just stood, head tilted, listening to the groan of the metal in the cooling air. When she came back in, her hair had loosened, the braids softening around her face. She sat at the table without invitation, her back straight, hands folded loosely in her lap. Luke set a plate in front of her, beans, a square of cornbread, a small piece of pork, and took his own seat opposite. They ate in silence, save for the muted scrape of tin forks against plates. Once, he saw her glance at the stove, watching the small flames shift behind the grate. Once, she caught him watching her hands, the way her fingers held the fork with a certain precision, as though eating in front of someone else was not something she did often. When the plates were empty, Luke stacked them, carried them to the basin, and poured the last of the warm water over them. Ayanna rose, took the rag from his hand, and began drying each dish as he washed. It was a quiet exchange, unspoken but balanced. Later, he sat on the edge of the bed to pull off his boots. Ayanna, wrapped in the wool blanket, lay on her side facing the wall, eyes open. The fire's light threw a dim gold across the room, painting the lines of her face in soft relief. Outside, the wind picked up, moving through the cottonwoods with a whisper that sounded almost like breath. The smell of cooling earth drifted in through the open window. Luke lay back, staring at the ceiling where a knot in the wood had split years ago into the shape of a small, crooked star. He didn't think about the men in town. He didn't think about the war, or the names he'd stopped saying aloud. He thought instead about the way she had stood at the well, hand on the pump, listening. The night settled heavy, the fire's glow shrinking to embers. In the space between his breath and hers, there was no claim, no bargain, no need for explanation, only the uneasy truce of two strangers under one roof, the air between them holding both distance and something not yet named. By morning, that distance would still be there. But the fact remained. They'd crossed the threshold together, and neither had turned back. The first morning came pale and sharp, the frost clinging to the grass like a thin lace. Luke stepped out onto the porch, boots thudding against the boards, and filled his lungs with the cold air until it burned. The horizon was a clean line, the sun not yet clear of it. Behind him, the door hinges gave a soft groan. Ayanna emerged wrapped in the wool blanket from the night before. She didn't shiver, though the breath from her lips curled white in the air. She glanced once toward the corral, then back to the well, as if making a quiet calculation. Luke nodded toward the pump. "Go ahead." She crossed the yard, each step unhurried. The handle gave its usual protest, a long groan followed by the deep gurgle of water climbing from the dark. She drew a bucket half full, carried it without spilling, and set it by the trough for the horses. Not a drop wasted. By the time she came back, Luke had a fire in the stove and coffee boiling. He poured 2 tin cups. She took hers without a word, warming her hands around the metal. The smell of the coffee mingled with the smoke, filling the small room with something almost like comfort. The days found a rhythm quickly. Luke worked the fence line, checked traps along the creek, mended tack in the barn. Ayanna kept mostly to the yard, fetching water, sweeping the porch, cooking when she chose to, though Luke never asked. At first, their paths barely crossed except at meals. Then, little by little, the small things began to shift. One afternoon, Luke came in from the south pasture to find his old canvas coat folded on the table. The seam at the left shoulder, split wide enough to show the lining, had been stitched neat and strong. Next to it sat his work gloves, the torn thumb patched with a square of leather cut from who knew where. He ran a thumb over the new thread, then looked toward the corner where Ayanna was kneeling by the stove, coaxing a low flame. She didn't look up, but the set of her shoulders told him she knew he'd seen. The next morning, he found her wooden water bucket, cracked and leaking since before she came, replaced with one from his own supplies. She didn't mention it. When she went to fill it, he saw the quick, small press of her lips together, like someone checking the shape of a thought before letting it go. They began to speak, though not much. A thank you when he passed her the salt. A yes when he asked if the roan was sound. Mostly it was the kind of talking that didn't disturb the air between them. Once, when the wind came hard from the north and rattled the windows. Luke returned from the barn to find the wool blanket draped over the bed instead of her place by the stove. She was outside, gathering the wash from the line before the storm took it. When she brought the shirts in, damp and snapping in the gusts, she set them by the fire without meeting his eye. He didn't move the blanket back to the floor that night. There was another time, near the end of that same week, when he was splitting kindling out back. Ayanna appeared at the edge of his vision, carrying a bundle of sage she'd gathered from the dry slope beyond the creek. She knelt, stripped the leaves with her fingers, and fed them into the fire. The scent rose sharp and clean, cutting through the smell of smoke and old wood. Luke paused, the axe hanging loose in his grip. That to keep the cold out. She didn't answer right away. It keeps what is not welcome from coming in, she said finally, her voice steady. It was the longest sentence she'd spoken since they'd left town. The small signs accumulated the way snow gathers, thin at first, then enough to change the shape of the land. A cup of coffee left waiting on the table when he came in late from the fields, his tools cleaned and set in order after he'd left them on the porch. Her hair, once tightly bound, worn looser in the evenings, the braids unraveling into waves as she sat near the fire, mending her own dress. Luke noticed, too, that she'd started tending the roan herself each evening, checking hooves, brushing the coat until it caught the firelight like copper. The mare followed her with the kind of easy trust that came from quiet hands and patience. One evening, as the sun slid behind the hills, Luke found himself on the porch, oiling the hinges of the front door. Ayanna stepped out, a small pot of stew in her hands. She set it on the rail between them, ladled a portion into his bowl, then one into hers. They ate standing there, side by side, watching the last of the light burn down to embers on the horizon. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. The air had that sharp, clean edge that meant frost by morning. When the bowls were empty, Ayanna took them inside. Luke stayed a while longer, listening to the sound of her moving about the kitchen, water in the basin, the clink of tin on wood. He thought about the way she'd stood on that platform in town, bound and alone, her chin high against the jeers. And now, here. She moved through his home as if each small task was a stone laid in some unseen path. They were still strangers in many ways, but with every quiet repair, every shared chore, every unspoken act of care, they were building something, thin as thread, but strong enough, maybe to hold. That night, when the wind rose again, rattling the shutters and sending cold fingers through the cracks, Luke stirred from his half-sleep to see Ayanna by the fire, adding a log. She glanced over her shoulder, caught his gaze, and for the first time, didn't look away. Right after. It wasn't a smile she gave him. Not yet. But it was close enough to feel like the beginning of one. The storm announced itself with a far-off shiver, thunder walking across the mountains like a slow-footed giant. Luke felt it first in the horses. The roan lifted her head, ears pinning, and his gelding rolled an eye toward the ridge. The air tasted like iron and sage. "Bring them in," he said, already moving. Ayanna was beside him without being asked, swinging the corral gate while Luke led the animals under the lean-to. The first drops hit the yard, like thrown pebbles. Wind slid its shoulder against the house and found every loose board. They worked quick. Ayanna hauled a stack of split pine to the porch, the hem of her dress darkening in a fringe of soaked cloth. Luke wrestled a patch of canvas over the grain barrels and hammered it down with 2 nails and the flat of his hand. By the time they stepped inside, the sky had gone the color of a bruise. Rain came hard, drumming on the roof in a steady, drenching roar. The smell of wet dust rose like a relic from the earth and pressed into the room with the first cold drafts. Luke wedged a folded rag where the door sagged and bled a line of water. Ayanna set a pan under a thin leak that started to tap from a knot in the roof. The lamplight turned the walls to honey and carved the window into a black square full of moving sound. They sat near the stove while the world outside emptied itself. There wasn't much to do but keep the fire even and keep the floor dry where the water gathered. Luke patched a strap on the tack with small Draco. Careful stitches. Ayanna parceled out the last of the cornmeal and stirred it into a pot with bones from 2 nights before, making something that tasted like warmth, if not quite like meat. Thunder rolled closer. It wasn't the sharp crack he remembered from summer storms. It was low and long, a train going by in the dark. He kept mending until his hands no longer felt like his own. The needle paused over the leather, hanging there. He set the strap aside. There was a ridge, he said, his voice sounding as if it had been stored in a box, too long. Ayanna didn't startle. She simply settled, eyes on the flame. Back east, cornfields, mud thick as lard, smoke so heavy the sun was a rumor. He saw the place the way a man sees his hands in water, warped, near, and far at once. We went up 3 times, came down twice. He didn't say which time he came down. He didn't say the name of the boy who hadn't, though the boy's laugh, high, foolish, could still ring, sometimes under his ribs while he was alone in the pasture. Another roll of thunder moved the lamp flame in its glass. Ayanna reached for the poker and settled a log, making room for the orange to breathe. She didn't look at him. Luke found he was grateful for the way she didn't look. "It takes a long time for a man to stop hearing," he said, quieter. "Years after there's nothing left to listen for." The rain shifted, went slantwise, rattling one window and then the other. Ayanna rose and wedged a folded scrap of cloth against the sash. When she sat again, she drew her knees close, shawl around her shoulders like a patient animal. Luke rubbed his thumb along the edge of the table. "My father kept a field of sorghum, said a straight row was a kind of prayer. I thought I'd spend my life making prayers like that." He let the silence fill in the rest, how he'd traded rows for lines of men, prayers for orders, a plow for a rifle that made his shoulder bloom blue each time it kicked. Ayanna made no sound, but the line of her jaw shifted, softening. The lamp's light found the tiny sheen the rain had left on the ends of her hair. She reached into the pocket of her dress and brought out a small pouch, leather, worn thin at the edges, tied with 2 strands of horsehair braided together. She set it on the table between them. The pouch carried the same smell the sage had carried when she fed it to the fire days ago. More than smell, a kind of memory housed in the fibers. She untied it and shook something small into her palm, a bead, blue as a piece of June sky, a chip of bone carved with a notch, a thin strip of copper bent like a crescent. She didn't name them. The thunder came again, closer now, then farther, as if the ridge itself were breathing. She closed her hand around the small things and spoke. A string of words that moved like water over stone, words Luke didn't know. She didn't offer a translation. She didn't need to. When she finished, she pushed one bead back into the pouch, then the bone, then the copper, and retied the horsehair with careful fingers. The pouch went back into her pocket. "Soldiers," she said at last, in their shared tongue, as if the storm had asked the question, and she was merely answering. She lifted her chin toward the dark window. They came after the rain once, when the ground would not hold a track. Her voice was even. We left what we could not carry. Luke swallowed. The stove ticked, settling. Ayanna didn't look for his face to change, didn't look for anything in him at all. The telling wasn't a plea. It was a placing of things on a table, this and this and this. "I led a horse that night," she continued. "She was old, her hooves filled with clay. I cut her loose by the mesquite when she fell. Her fingers, folded around the shawl's edge, tightened once, then eased. In the morning, I knew the men hadn't gone far. Vultures will tell you what the sun will show later." Luke's own hands had closed without him noticing. He let them open. The rain ran steady. The lamplight lapped at the corners of the room like low water. He thought of the way she had stood on the platform in town, how the rope had made a red line on her ankle, how she'd stepped down like a queen who had decided dirt was as good as any floor. He stood and crossed to the small cedar chest he'd opened the first night to find her a blanket. From its bottom, he took a tin cup with a dent and a narrow-necked bottle of lamp oil, the color of straw. He returned with the cup, poured coffee from the pot, and set it in front of her. He didn't add sugar because he never had any. He didn't apologize for that. She warmed her fingers around the cup. Steam moved in a thin ribbon into the air, then vanished. She drank and set the cup down, leaving a ring on the table that would dry and be gone. The storm held them for 2 days. The road vanished beneath a lake of thin brown water, and the dry creek spoke for the first time in months, shouldering along with its new weight. They slept and woke to the same drum on the roof, the same dull silver light squeezed through clouds. They worked side by side as if they'd always meant to, passing the knife handle back and forth while they shaved a plug for a drafty knothole, tying a rag around a window where the glass rattled, spreading a saddle blanket across the floor where the wind crept under the door and came up, cold. When thunder boiled too near, Luke's eyes went to the walls, the way a man's eyes go to a line of trees when he knows a volley will come from there. Ayanna noticed. She moved then, not to him, but to the stove or the window or the pot, putting her hands where work lived until the sound rolled past. Once, she touched 2 fingers to the doorframe as she crossed it, like a woman counting the house and finding it still standing. Luke told one more story the second night, when the storm's voice had dropped to a mutter. "There was a boy," he said. "He put a corn silk tassel in the band of his hat and said it would make him lucky. He smiled, the kind of smile a man gives to a photograph before he puts it away. He was wrong. He looked, then, at the bead in her memory, and the copper and the carved bone, and he said nothing more. She answered, not with words, but by setting his mended coat, dry now, warmed by the fire, over the back of his chair before she lay down. He lifted it, felt the even pull of her stitches under his fingers, and put it on, though the room didn't require it. By the third morning, the storm had worn itself thin. Rain light made the yard a shallow mirror. The well's stone ring shone new. A jay complained from the cottonwoods like a cranky old woman. Luke opened the door, and the smell of the washed world met him. Clean, almost sweet. Behind him, Ayanna stood, shawl around her shoulders, the small line between her brows smoothed by sleep. They didn't speak. They stepped out together and stood under the awning of the porch as drips counted the last moments of the storm. Somewhere under their feet, the earth took in what it could and let go of the rest. Luke felt it, then, a quiet he hadn't felt since before the ridge, before the mud and smoke. It wasn't the emptiness that follows noise. It wasn't the wild quiet of distance. It was the kind that arrives when two people have said enough to let silence do the rest. He looked once at Ayanna and saw her looking not at him, but at the world, measuring the edges of it after the water. Her face held nothing he could name, and yet he knew the count was fair. The last of the thunder walked away into the hills. The lamp inside burned low, the room behind them holding the smell of coffee and damp wool and pine. The storm had left them where it found them, under one roof. Only the roof felt larger, somehow, as if it had learned to cover more than boards and air. After the storm, the ground opened like a held breath released. A shy green worked up through the brown, grass blades thin as needlepoints, lamb's quarters along the fence, a scatter of yellow fiddlenecks on the rise. The creek forgot how to whisper and spoke outright for a time, the water brown and quick, then settling into its old channel with fresh edges. Work changed with the light. Luke set new posts where the flood had shouldered the fence aside. Ayanna steadied each one while he tamped the earth, their rhythm finding itself without talk. She carried the wire and the little sack of staples. He set the pull with his pliers. Her hand was there with the hammer, just as his needed it. The clink of metal, the thud of tamped soil, the hollow drum of a post set true. They filled the morning better than any words might have. At the garden patch by the lean-to, they turned the wet earth with a short-handled spade and an old hoe, opening rows as straight as the ground allowed. Luke showed her the way his father had done it, string tied between two sticks, a line to keep the furrows honest. She walked the string, feet set careful, shoulders easy. With a small cloth bag she'd sewn from one of his worn shirts, she tapped seed into the cool soil, beans, squash. A handful of sorghum Luke had kept in a jar for years because he liked the sound it made when it shifted. She covered each seed with the side of her palm, then pressed, leaving neat ovals like the prints of a quiet animal. Once, while she worked, she pulled a pinch of gray ash from the stove pan and dusted the earth in a narrow line. She didn't explain. Luke didn't ask. The ash looked right there, like a line on a map, only she knew how to read. They spoke in fragments. Gate's loose. I'll fetch nails. Try the other notch on that buckle. The words slid into the day, like stones into water. There, but not changing the current much. One afternoon, the mule took it into his head that a particular gate was the end of the world. He planted his feet, squared his chest, and made a noise that sounded like a rusty hinge being surprised. Luke set his shoulder to the lead. The mule leaned back as if he meant to pull the sky down. Ayanna watched, eyes narrowed against the light. Without comment, she walked to the fence, broke a wild carrot from the ditch, and snapped the top free. She held the green plume to the mule's nostrils. He sniffed, offended, then curious, then not at all noble as his lips fumbled for it. When she drew her hand away, he followed, dignity circling back to find them both already through the gate. The mule sneezed hard, dust and indignation in a single burst, right into Luke's shirt. For a heartbeat there was nothing. Then a sound came from Ayanna that he had not heard yet, a soft, surprised laugh that caught itself, then carried. Luke looked down at his dusted chest, then at her, and found out his own mouth knew the shape of an answer. The laugh stayed with them longer than sound does. It sat in the afternoon like a small bright thing on the fence rail. Near sundown they checked the horses. The roan leaned into the brush, lower lip slack with pleasure, while Ayanna worked the curry in slow circles along her rib. Luke's gelding nickered, head bumping Luke's shoulder until he scratched the sweet spot under the jaw, when a burr hid itself deep in the roan's fetlock. Ayanna crouched, patient. The burr held fast, mean with tiny teeth. She hissed once when a spine found skin and kept working. Luke knelt beside her and turned the leg just so, his hand firm and calm. Her fingers slid against his as the burr came free. It was not much, a brush of warmth, shared breath, the dry smell of horse sweat and dust, but it held the steadiness of a promise neither of them said out loud. She did not pull her hand away right away. He did not let go too quickly. The roan snorted, and the moment found its shape, and then moved on. Evenings stretched. Sometimes Ayanna sat on the step with a length of rawhide in her lap, braiding it into a thin, strong cord with a blue bead worked near one end. She tied the finished braid around the pump handle, bead showing just where the metal met stone, not decoration so much as a quiet mark. This is where water and hands meet. Luke planed a smooth board from a scrap of cedar and fixed it to the wall above the table. The second thing on that shelf, after the tin of coffee, was the small leather pouch she kept in her pocket when she worked. He put it there without comment. She saw it there, and did not move it. On a day warmed enough to smell like new grass, Luke harnessed the team to the old walking plow that had been sleeping in the lean-to since long before the war. He'd oiled the handles 2 nights before, the wood drinking what it needed. He strung 2 rows, set the blade into the topsoil, and leaned his weight forward. The beam shivered, then held. The furrow opened clean behind the blade, the earth turning like a page that had been heavy to lift. Ayanna took the lead rope at the horses' heads, talking low and even. The team listened. Luke let the first furrow straighten the rest in his chest. He walked behind, arms taking the plow's push, eyes half on the line, half on the small dust devils that rose and died in the sun. When they reached the end of the row, the world behind them had a new seam in it. They shared a look that acknowledged the seam without celebrating it. Then they turned and laid another. There were softer hours, too, the kind that arrive after work has been done square with the daylight. A meadowlark staked its claim on the fence post and threw its liquid notes into the open. Ayanna hummed sometimes as she mended, a low tune with a shape Luke did not know but could follow. He tapped one finger on his knee to it. She heard and didn't change the tune. Once, when she rose from the chair, she left the shawl around his shoulders without pausing for the picture it made. When sleep came thin, Luke sometimes sat up, the old ridge flaring in him at the scrape of a branch or the far rattle of hooves. Those nights he stood at the door and counted, the way a man counts under his breath to keep particular things from coming back. Ayanna would pass behind him, 2 fingers finding the shelf near his elbow as she moved through the room, touching the house the way she had during the storm, not touching him, but leaving a small, steady mark of presence on the air. The counting eased sooner when she did. There were 2 small changes, neither named. Her blanket migrated from the stove to the stretch of floor between the table and the bed. Then from the floor to a straw tick Luke brought down from the loft and shook out on a day with a clean wind. He said it without commentary. That night she lay there, and the breath of the house, hers, the quiet sighs of settling wood, found a shared pace. They rode out together on a Sunday when the sun climbed easy and no chore pinched for time. The hills wore green like a rumor more than a fact, but it was there if you looked. They followed a deer path up to a knoll where the whole of the valley ran out at their feet, like a hide stretched and tacked to the horizon. Wind lifted the edge of Ayana's braid. The blue bead at the pump would have flashed, if it could have seen itself from there. Luke pointed, not to claim, only to name, the dark line of cottonwoods, the bright scratch of the creek, the broken-backed fence he still meant to mend one day, when the light was long and the air cool enough to keep a man honest. Ayana nudged the roan forward and reached into a stand of rabbit brush. She broke a stem, rubbed the sap between finger and thumb, and held it up. He leaned closer. The smell came tart and clean, with the faintest sweetness beneath. She didn't smile, but the corners of her eyes eased. He thought, unexpected as rain in December, of what it might be to know the names of plants the way he knew the weight of fence wire. Going down. The path slipped where the storm had shaved the hillside. The roan hesitated, hind feet searching. Ayana shifted her weight to help the mare find the ground. A stone rolled. Instinct, not plan. Brought Luke's hand across the gap. Her palm met his, dry and strong. For 3 steps they moved as one animal, 2 riders, 4 hands, 8 hooves, a body of balance arranged by a shared intention. At the bottom, they let go. No word marked the letting go. It marked itself by what didn't need saying. That evening, a wind came in off the flats, warm and smelling of sun-cured grass. They sat the porch with bowls of stew and watched the sky invent colors it would forget by morning. When the first star showed, Ayana lifted her chin toward it the way a woman nods to a friend across a room. Luke saw the gesture and felt something true, settle where other things had once rattled. They didn't talk about what they were building. They carried it, each at an end, the way 2 people carry a plank across a yard, eyes forward, feet careful, trust in the shared steadiness more than the thing itself. Nights. The house breathed slow around them. Mornings. The pump gave water, bead winking once when light found it. The mule still doubted gates, but less so. The garden rows kept their prayers. And between one day and the next, without ceremony, the space between them became a place where hands could meet and did. By late summer, the light thinned at the edges, turning brass before it went. The bean vines made small ladders up the sticks. The sorghum lifted tassels the wind combed with a lazy hand. Dust lay in the road like powder between wagon ruts. On a Tuesday, a wagon crested the rise with a tired horse and a bell that hardly remembered how to ring. The peddler's hat brim had seen too many suns. He set his brake with a stick and a wish and climbed down, boots jittering on stiff ankles. "Mallory," he said, as if they'd made an appointment. His eyes flicked to Ayana once, not long enough to make Luke's shoulders settle wrong, but long enough to show that eyes were the first thing a man sells. He opened the tailboard like a stage curtain, bolts of calico, lengths of ribbon, needles, a tin mirror the size of a man's hand, a clutch of cheap rings that claimed to be silver and weren't, iron nails in a canvas sack, 2 boxes of percussion caps, a few paper envelopes of seeds with pictures bright enough to argue with drought. The cart also held news, as all such carts do. A railroad farther north, soldiers drilling out at the post, a preacher setting up a tent and promising hellfire at a discount. "Coffee?" Luke asked. "Beans and deer." The man said, business-beating piety as usual. Luke bought a small sack anyway. He added nails, considered the mirror, then left it. The peddler turned to Ayana with a salesman's soft step. He held up a ribbon the color of a robin's egg, and another the color of blood. She looked once at the first, once at the second, then passed both to the little envelopes of seed. She tapped one that showed a red flower like a star. The man squinted down. "Zinnias," he said, making the word sound like something you could eat. She bought that, and a packet of needle points that flashed when Sun found them. "Ma'am," the peddler said, doing her the courtesy he could afford, "I lay over 2 nights and push on. If you favor the agency east or the big towns west, I can see you as far as Tucson or the other way. Folks traveling these days, some going to where their people went before, some to where folks say they'll be new." The word laid itself quiet in the hot air. New. Luke set the nail sack in the crook of his arm. He watched Ayana's face the way a man reads cloud edges. She lifted the seed packet to the light, let it show through, then lowered it. Her eyes moved once to the horizon, as they always did, and then to the peddler's horse, ribs counting themselves under hide. "How much water between here and where you turn?" she asked. Not urgency, just the good sense a road requires. 4 days lean if you angle south, 5 if you don't like army dust and take the high road, he said. "I trade for water when I can. I carry enough not to beg when I can't." "What would you ask?" she said. "Small fee," he answered, naming a number that would buy a winter of flour if flour came dear. "Or trade. I take beadwork if the pattern sells, horsehair if it's tight and true." The wind nudged the seed envelope in her hand. Luke stood still, calm the way deep water looks. His chest held the ache a man gets when he lifts something before he knows the weight. He didn't say a thing that required an answer. He had learned what asking can do to a choice. 2 nights, the peddler said again. "I'll roll at first light day after." He left the mirror where it caught the sun and sent a white coin of light shivering up the house wall. Then he rattled away to the cottonwoods to set his camp. That evening, Luke set hinges on the door of a little shed he'd started in spring and never finished. He cut them from scrap iron, squared them against the jamb, and set the nails with a deliberate hand. He felt the peddler's words like a horseshoe nail in his palm, small, precise, able to hold a life to a thing or pry it off. He drove each nail clean, flush, then planed the door's edge until it took the latch without complaint. Inside, Ayana sat with the last of the light on her hair. She had the blue bead pouch on the table, the cord unknotted, from the horsehair braid she'd made weeks ago. She pulled a length free and worked another bead into it, the copper crescent this time. The thin strip bent smooth with thumb and patience. She tied the braid around a small willow switch she'd cut from the creek, the leaf slender and new. The switch looked like nothing a man could count on. It looked like something that wanted to. At dawn, the peddler's smoke sent a thin gray claws into the sky. Luke tightened the cinch on his gelding, then loosened it a hole because the day would be long. Ayana stood at the well, the willow switch in her hand, the braid bright against the green. She didn't look toward the road. She set the switch in the damp place where a puddle had been and knelt to press the earth. Luke worked the pump handle until the water came simple and clear. It slid into the hole, darkening soil, then sinking as if the ground had a thirst it was shy to mention. Around noon, the peddler rattled into the yard again. Hat tipped, he didn't dismount. "Well," he said. He had the manner of a man who expects to be told yes and has a discouragement folded in his pocket for when he isn't. Ayana walked to the wagon. She held up the packet of seeds, the envelope thin now where her fingers had memorized it. She set it on the board. Then she sat down. Next to it, a small coil of horsehair braid finished tight. The bead and the crescent worked in clean and plain. She slid the braid toward him. "For your coffee," she said. It was not the trade he'd come for. He took it anyway. Men like him know when to accept the smaller coin. "Good luck to you both," he said, tugging the brim. He meant it enough to make it worth saying. He clucked to the horse. The wagon turned its tired circle and found the road. Dust rose, argued a while with the air, and fell where it always falls. They waited until the dust settled. Ayanna moved the shadow of her palm over the willow leaves. Luke felt the ache in his chest shift to a place that didn't pinch. He fetched 2 lengths of rawhide and bound 3 creek stones together, set them like a low wall at the young tree's feet, a small guard against the hard, patient world. Toward evening, they saddled and rode, just to see what the day had made. The sun chose a red he'd been saving. Their shadows laid themselves long across the low grass, 2 lines that met and parted and met again as ground rose and fell. They took the deer path up to the knoll that had told them the valley's name before. The wind made a slow hand through the dry tops of the grass. Far off, the creek kept its new phrases. Luke pointed, not to claim. He knew by now that the land belongs to weather and time, and the first to name it, and even then only while the light lasts. But to show, the square of the field holding its green, the thin smoke from their stove curling mild. The fence line he'd keep honest if his hand stayed steady another season. Ayanna looked, taking it in like a careful reckoning, the way she had after the storm. She reached over, and her gloved knuckle found the back of his glove for the span of 2 breaths. The touch had the weight of a word used properly. They turned home at dusk, letting the horses pick the sure places. At the well, the new willow kept its one brave color. Ayanna dipped the bucket and walked slow, carrying without slosh. Luke watched the way water found leaf and leaf drank. In the doorway he had set 2 small pegs he'd whittled from cedar, side by side. They were nothing. They waited like open hands. She hung the shawl on one and the hat she wore sometimes on the other. He stepped past her to the shelf and set the coffee and the seed envelope together. The house took their steps as if it had always known them. After supper, while the stove ticked itself to sleep, Luke took a cartridge case from a box under the bed, spent brass with the faint smell of work in it still. He heated it over the low flame until it softened, and the shine ran dull. With the back of his knife he worked it round and flat. He drilled a hole with a gimlet and sanded the edges until they remembered how to be kind. He didn't look up while he worked. When he finished, the brass lay in his palm like a small coin of sun that hadn't decided whether to be a ring or a token. He set it on the table and pushed it halfway across, not to her exactly, but to the place her hand would find if it meant to. She looked at it a long time. Then she reached for the willow switch she'd tied and took the horsehair braid that had left the peddler's cart and reappeared under her clever hands. Another length, tight and honest. She threaded it through the small hole and tied a simple knot that would not slip. She rose and stepped to the door. Outside, the night smelled of cut hay and the far, metallic taste of stars. She lifted the brass and hung it from the nail Luke had set above the lintel, sometime in the years he'd forgotten to expect anyone to notice. The little circle turned once in a breeze and steadied. Neither of them named it. When they lay down, the house breathed the slow breath of a place that has learned the names of its people. The willow in the yard made a faint, dry rattle. Not from thirst. Luke had watered well, but from want of growing. Ayanna's hand rested open on the blanket between them, not touching his, not far. The silence had the shape that good silences have, room for 2, and a roof. In the morning, the bead at the pump found the sun. The horses stamped. The mule reconsidered the day and decided in its favor. The world did what it does, and they rose into it, the ground under their boots taking their weight without surprise. Years later, there would be no ledger line to show where one life folded into another, No preacher's stamp, no photograph in a gilt case, only marks a different kind of book keeps. A bead fixed where hands meet water, a young willow that learned the wind's ways and cast shade the shape of a circle on August afternoons. 2 cedar pegs, polished by use, a shelf that remembered the weight of coffee and seed, fence posts plumb because 4 hands had agreed on true. People who pass through a country read it by scars and blessings. If they were the kind to look hard, they could see both at Luke Mallory's place. The field rose kept their prayer. The pump handle gleamed where fingers had polished it into a testimony. A copper crescent winked from the lintel when noon came clean. None of it proved anything to a court. All of it proved enough to a life. Ayanna stayed because staying became a thing she made each day. The way a blanket grows from a beginning and patience. Luke learned that belonging is not claimed by deed paper, but by the small consent of mornings. The coffee poured before a word. The door latched against a storm, the way a house learns 2 sets of footfalls and keeps time with both. Neither of them asked the other to be new. Each brought what the road hadn't taken and set it down. The world, often, is unkind about that. Some days still carried dust. Some nights still woke the old thunder in bones. They did not cure each other. They did something harder. They endured together. There is a kind of love the West recognizes because it knows the weather that makes it. It doesn't shine much. It holds. In holding, it turns a rough square of boards into a home, a stranger's silence into a shared quiet, a last branch cut from a creek bank into a tree that throws shade across 2 graves someday, and, for a long time before that, across a table where hands rest open.